All stand. Coronial Court now stands with you. Please begin. Just before we go to you, Mr. Mullins, can I ask a couple of questions?
Certainly, Your Honour.
Thanks. Miss Gill, I'm just asking the particular role that you were playing that day. Was that a particularly busy on-call role, or is it one that is, it's quite rare to receive calls?
No, it can be a very busy on-call role.
And was it a busy day that day?
Yes, that's correct.
What are the other sorts of jobs that you were dealing with that day?
So I had some transport issues with one of our Aboriginal health practitioners that was going from training. Also, we had a bus versus a car incident on the Ernest Giles, and so we had activated 2 of our health centres to attend to that as well.
So you were dealing with a number of issues.
That's correct.
And I understand that in that role, the person that you would normally be liaising with is Fiona Cameron.
On that rostered day, yes.
And part of the difficulty in communications was because Fiona's telephone system was intermittent, and so a third person was brought into the communication stream.
That's correct.
And sometimes you could speak to David and sometimes you could speak to Fiona.
That's correct.
And that may also have contributed to communication difficulties and information being lost as between the 3 people who were
That's
sharing
correct.
that information.
Yep.
Yes, Mr. Mullins.
Yes, thank you, Your Honour. Ms Gill, my name is Mullins. I appear on behalf of the Brown, Walker, Lane and Robertson families. Now, you have worked as a remote area nurse in Central Australia for a lengthy period of time,
That's correct.
and you list in your second affidavit some of the areas where you've worked, including Docker River, Elliot, Finke, is it?
Fink.
Laramba,
That's correct.
and of course you spent a couple of tours in Yuendamu.
That's correct.
And you've always enjoyed the work that you've done in those communities?
That's correct.
Even when you've spent some time in management, I see that you are happy to return to nursing and to clinical practice from time to time?
That's correct.
And do you see yourself as one of the nurses rather than management?
When I'm on the ground, yes.
Is it the case, because of the experiences that you have, that you feel you have a close affinity to the nursing staff?
I would accept that.
And certainly when nursing staff are at remote locations, you can empathise with some of the things that they have been through or are going through.
I accept that.
Now, you're asked some questions about the 11:30 meeting, and I just wanted to clarify to your recollection who was there. Sorry, I should say 11:40 meeting. In paragraph 74 of your statement, you list a conference call with Janine Rawaka.
That's correct.
Have you got a copy of your statement in front of you?
I do.
And then you list all of the people on the call.
That's correct.
And Amy Rosser is not there.
She wasn't on the call that I was aware of.
You didn't initiate the call, Janine did.
That's correct. That's correct, sorry.
Okay. Now, there's some evidence from one witness, I think, Luana Simons, who thinks she was there. But you have no recollection of Amy being on the call at all?
No, Amy wasn't in community at the time.
Do you recollect any comments of Amy at all on that call?
Not on that call, no.
Okay. Nola Fisher was a person who you dealt with when you were in Yuendamu,
That's correct.
and you got along very well with Nola.
That's correct.
She was a great support to you at the community.
That's correct.
And what were the sorts of things that Nola would do that would help you on a day-to-day basis?
When I was working within Uindamu, Nola was a person that if I was unclear of a situation or of family relationships, she was someone that was able to explain those, in particular around children and the welfare of the children that we may have been dealing with in the clinic. She was also able to give me some instruction on language, as in interpretation of what people were saying when I was not able to understand.
Now, you were smiling when you said that. Is that because you had some problems with language from time to time?
Sometimes, yes.
And she assisted you there.
That's correct.
Is it the case that Nola from time to time actually performs some clinical tasks?
Early in my role within travelling to Uindamu, I would say yes, and that her history has been that. That's correct.
And can you tell us some of the clinical tasks that you recollect her performing?
So Nola was a Aboriginal health practitioner who took a clinical load, which was seen anybody that came into the community, into the health centre, and required medical assessment. During my time, she didn't participate in on-call. She may have previously to me, but also she then progressed into a specialty of child health and working with the child health team.
Now, the decision you had to make on 9 November 2019 was a very difficult decision.
I accept that.
And you had a lot of telephone calls.
That's correct.
And you had a great deal of empathy for what the nurses were going through.
That's correct.
And you wanted to make sure that the nursing staff that you were dealing with were well looked after.
That's correct.
And you did the best you could.
That's correct.
At about 11:50, you had a conversation, I think, with Fiona.
That's correct.
Cameron, about the decision you were going to convey. At about 12:10, you had a conversation with David Reeve, I think, where you were conveying a decision, or had a discussion with him about the decision you were going to convey.
That's correct.
And in fact, you had multiple conversations with those two people who were both senior to you during the course of the day as the decision was unfolding.
That's correct.
Did either of them say to you, have you done a documented risk assessment setting out the factors that you are taking into account in this decision?
No, they did not.
Did either of them say to you, were the Walpre members of staff part of that meeting at about 11:40 a.m?
No, they did not.
You've been asked a lot of questions over the last 3 years about these events.
That's correct.
And as you've said, you checked with management the entire way during the course of the process on this day.
I accept that.
But you've accepted responsibility for the decision that you made.
I certainly have.
Nothing further. Thank you, Honour.
Yes.
Hello, my name's Mr. Derrick. I appear on behalf of Naja. Now, I know you've already spoken a little bit about this topic, but I just wanted to speak to you a little bit about the Aboriginal staff members from the clinic. What do you see as their value, or local Aboriginal staff, to a clinic? What do they bring to the clinic? What's their value?
They bring an awareness of the culture for that area that we're working within. I see them as an active participant with ensuring that the non-Indigenous staff practice in a culturally appropriate and safe manner whilst in that community. They are certainly a broker between community and non-Indigenous staff, and in sometimes you could say that within health, they were a broker between community and the health service in general. They're also a broker with the health staff and the community engagement that we do.
And do you think sometimes there can be people who might pass on information to what's
Absolutely.
happening in the community, so they might know what's happening,
Certainly,
and that might be helpful for clinic staff to make decisions and whatnot?
I accept that.
So, then given the circumstance that was occurring on the 9th of November, do you think they could assist?
Excuse me. Sorry, what was that?
Sorry. Do you think they could have given you, or the team, valuable advice about what they understood about break-ins?
I accept that.
And possibly, if not immediately, but maybe in the future, ways to try and stop the break-ins and things like that, or work with the community to stop that?
That's correct.
Yeah. And if it was the case that there was going to be withdrawal, perhaps they could assist. If there was going to be a bit of withdrawal, perhaps they could assist with communicating that message to the community.
I'd accept that.
And maybe they'd even tell you who the best people to speak to in the community about that, to get that message around. They might be able to do that.
I accept that.
And do you think one thing they might have also done is potentially, from the community's perspective, sort of raised a concern about the risks to the community for withdrawal?
Potentially, yes.
Now, just wanted to ask you a couple of questions about sort of risk assessment and things like that. So in paragraphs 36 to 50 of your second affidavit, you talk through how you would do a risk consideration, and you talk through the way you consider risk to staff and the way you would mitigate the risk to that staff, and how to mitigate the risk to the community once the decision to withdraw has been made. Yep. Now, you'd agree in those paragraphs that there's no consideration of the risk to the community before the decision to withdraw has been made. So what I mean by that is that there might be a consideration of how to avoid risks if a withdrawal occurs, but in those paragraphs you don't consider the risk to the community before the decision to withdraw has been made.
Without reading thoroughly right at this point, I would have to accept that.
Okay. Do you think that should be something that should be taken into account when doing these kinds of risk assessments?
Yes.
Yep. And do you think it should be the case that the risk, there should be maybe a weighing exercise, that the risk to the nurses should be weighed against the risk to the community more generally?
Yes.
Withdrawal. Okay. Now, just probably to the perspective of lessons learned and looking forward into the future, just want to ask you about some considerations that should have been made potentially around the 11:40 meeting or perhaps during the day. What I'm going to say is a series of propositions. Let me know if there was a discussion about these things. To begin with, was there any, up until the decision had been made, in terms of the communications that you've had with various people, was there any talk about anyone suggesting alternatives to withdrawal, such as bringing in private security or something like that?
No.
Was there, at that stage, up until the decision being made, any talk about whether or not police might be able to bring in more assistance to assist the nurses or anything like that?
No. Are we talking about the decision that I was notified of at 11? Yep.
And just only what you know as well.
Sure.
Do you remember anyone discussing through NT Health's withdrawal policy at that stage?
No.
Was anyone talking about doing handovers for more vulnerable patients in the community?
Yes.
Okay. And what kind of discussion was that? What was
So we had I discussed vulnerable persons at that 11:40 meeting, and if there were any acutely unwell people in general, as well as vulnerable persons within community, and what provisions if they UNDMU old persons programs and could be provided for them.
And I believe your evidence is that you wanted to make sure that medication was provided and things like that.
That's correct.
When you were talking through these vulnerable patients, did any particular names come up or any individuals come up that were out of the queue? Did anyone in these conversations discuss maybe talking to, say, Purple House and their nurses about ways to mitigate risks? Okay. Now, at paragraph 78 of your second affidavit, you talk about Cassandra Holland requesting if she could stay. And ultimately you say, you talk it through and then you quote, this would leave her in a difficult and unsafe position. Attending the call-outs alone is contrary to NT health policy. Cassie told me that she understood.
That's correct.
So just to check, that policy you're referring to, is that the requirement that 2 staff members in the minimum were required for each call-out?
That's correct.
Now, is it the case that that policy operates that it has to be 2 nurses, or could it say be an Aboriginal staff member and a nurse?
That's correct. So the policy states for Central Australia and the Barkly region that it can be a clinician, whether that is a nurse or an Aboriginal health practitioner as first on call, and it can be a secondary clinician or a second responder. In the top end, the policy states that in the top end it has to be 2 clinicians.
Now, Ms Holland gives evidence, and for everyone that else's benefits, Ms Holland's given evidence that Julie Cook suggested that her partner and herself might leave the next day instead of on the 9th.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that was in the 11:40 meeting. Do you recall that occurring?
I don't recall that, but it may have been while I wasn't on the phone.
Okay. And just assume that did occur, would it be the case at that stage that you might consider, well, if Julie's staying around and Cassandra wants to stay around at least for that day, that perhaps that might have been sufficient to cover the on-call?
That's correct.
Okay. And sorry, and I might just take one step back. If, say, it was Cassandra who wanted to stay and, say, one of the Aboriginal health workers was happy to assist as well for on-call calls, would that have, do you think that might have been a workable situation?
It may have been, but we would still need to take into consideration the rationale as to why we were withdrawing staff, and that was due to the break-ins to their accommodation. So we needed to still provide a safe environment and accommodation for our staff.
At paragraph 48 of your first affidavit, you're talking there about whether or not it's acceptable that UNDMU be withdrawn and whatnot. You say that this would be acceptable because of the experience, and that Yulamu would cover Yundamu. You say that this would be acceptable because of the experience of the nurses limiting the assistance to emergency situations, further support from Papunya, no adverse weather effects. Now, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but according to your extended timeline, it doesn't appear that you yourself contacted Papunya. Is that correct?
Not on that timeline, that's correct.
Are you aware of anyone contacting Papunya to provide that?
No.
Now, going back one step about Yulamu, I believe Dr. Reeves' evidence is he gave a direction that 2 staff from Yundamu would need to assist at Yulamu, or go to Yulamu to assist. At that time, on that day, I appreciate you didn't speak to Dr. Reeve about that initially, but did you understand that Dr. Reeve had made that direction, or did you think it was more of a request?
My understanding was that it was a request.
You did speak to Dr. Reeve later on that day. Did you guys talk about that direction/request?
No.
Okay. Right. Now, when you did speak to, I believe, Janine, when she advised you that none of the Yundamu nurses were willing to go to Yulamu, you said in your evidence today that what you considered was you didn't think it was appropriate to give a direction, and you're considering the trauma of the staff. That would assume, on that basis, you assumed that all the nurses were traumatised, is that right?
At some level, yes, to state that they're unsafe.
Okay. And you would be aware, though, from what you understood at that point in time, that some nurses didn't have their houses broken into on that night, and some did, is that right?
I'm aware of that.
And so, did you think, appreciating that did you assume all nurses, even if their houses weren't broken into, that they would feel a sense of fear? Is that what you were assuming at that stage?
I would assume that.
Now, did you ever think, though, that, okay, fair enough, some nurses have been broken into. Did you think, though, that perhaps some of those nurses who weren't so directly affected might have been able to go to Yulamu instead?
Yes.
Yep. And so did you think, or maybe we should direct those nurses who weren't so directly affected to work from Yulamu?
No, I didn't think that. I made the request as I was asked to do, and the response was received that there wasn't any staff members, so that's what I needed to work on.
Okay. Appreciate that hindsight's 2020 and whatnot. But in retrospect, do you think it could have been a workable solution that the less affected nurses could have been directed to assist at Yulamu?
Sure.
This is a bit of a throwaway line in your evidence, but I thought I'd just ask the question. At paragraph 134 of your second affidavit, you mentioned that you had a communication about the Yundamu Health Centre was burning. This is a very brief reference.
That's correct.
I'm going to read to you some of the evidence from, I believe, Commander Worst, Travis Worst in any case, about that. And you let me know if you know any different in your experiences in your position.
Can I just, what paragraph is it?
Sorry, that's 134, the second.
Surely Ms. Gill could just be asked what she did know about that.
Well, no, I prefer to ask my question, thank you. Following it, so what...
So we're talking, sorry, just for my benefit, 134 of this witness's
That's correct, yes.
affidavit,
Yes.
second affidavit?
That's correct, yes. It's very brief reference.
134. Yes, okay.
Okay, so what he provides is, following an SMS from Nobs at 11:24 p.m. indicating that clinic had been torched. At later time, I do not recall I advised fire at health clinic was not significant and there was little or no damage to the health clinic infrastructure. I was not provided any information to the source of the fire or whether or not it was deliberately lit. So that's what Commander Worst says, Travis Worst says. Is that, from your knowledge of the clinic, is that correct, that there was little or no damage to the clinic?
That's correct.
And again, to your own knowledge, are you aware of any information that suggests that whether or not it was deliberately lit?
No, I have no.
Okay, thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you.
There might be more. I'll just check.
Sorry.
I have some questions, you want to?
Yes, Mr.
I might go there.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's all. Hello, Miss Gill.
Good morning, Mr. Hutton.
I want to start with the timelines and the questions that you're asked by Councillor Sissing. You've attached the first timeline was prepared, I understand, on the 10th of November 2019,
That's correct.
and the second timeline's been prepared much more recently than that.
That's correct.
The first timeline that you prepared, did you endeavour in that document to try to set out every word of every conversation that you've been involved in on 9 November or on 10 November?
No.
It wasn't intended to be that, was it? It wasn't intended to be exhaustive.
No.
You've then tried, for the purposes of this inquest, to provide what further information you could to Her Honour
That's correct.
in order to assist Her Honour in conducting this inquest.
That's correct.
And I appreciate the care and consideration and reflection that is obviously shown by the affidavit material that's been provided.
Thank you.
Thank you. You were not thinking of potential adverse findings that might be made.
No.
You weren't thinking about the root cause analysis.
That's correct.
Have you been provided a final copy of the root cause analysis?
Recently I have, yes.
When were you provided that?
Approximately 3 weeks ago. 3 or 4 weeks ago.
In your first affidavit, you were responding to 10 questions asked of you by Megan Duncan, is that correct?
That's correct.
Again, in that document, you were not trying to relay everything that you could recall.
That's correct.
You were asked by Councillor Sisting, and I think you agreed with this proposition, but tell me if I'm wrong, that you think it's likely the second timeline is in fact missing telephone conversations?
That's correct.
And that is because I anticipate you're involved in so many that day, is that right?
That's correct.
And you've told Her Honour that there are other incidents happening that day as well.
That's correct.
Right. I want to ask you about the group telephone conversation, the 1140 conversation as it's been referred to. Firstly, as to its participants, you weren't there in you were in Alice Springs.
That's correct.
Is it possible that there are other staff who were dialing into the telephone conversation that you were not aware of?
That's a possibility, yes.
Do you recall during that teleconference that, and I take it from your evidence to Mr. Derry, I'll just ask the question. Do you recall a discussion of the vulnerable persons list during the group teleconference?
Yes.
Can you tell Her Honour what the vulnerable persons list is?
So it's a list that we have within our service that is obviously vulnerable persons, which can be those with rheumatic heart disease, diabetes, any children that are under child and family services, any children with medical conditions that we need to monitor, some of our aged, and anyone providing that or requiring that extra level of care.
Thank you. Do you recall being told how many people were on the vulnerable persons list?
I believe there were 15 on the list.
The list is updated monthly, is that correct?
That's correct.
Do you recall asking during the group telephone conversation whether anyone in Yuendamu was acutely unwell?
Yes, I do.
What was the answer?
No, there was no.
Do you recall who said that?
I think it was Cassie that told me that.
She was on call at the time.
That's correct.
Do you recall asking that the offer to withdraw the Aboriginal staff be made to those staff?
That's correct.
And you recall the response coming back that they did not wish to be withdrawn?
That's correct.
Do you recall why that was?
No, I did not ask.
Did the Aboriginal staff in Yuendamu at that time participate in the on-call roster?
No.
Had they been asked previously if they wished to participate in the on-call roster?
Previously there were conversations.
And they had expressed that they did not wish to participate?
That's correct.
Do you know why that was?
No.
That was respected and they were not consequently a part of the on-call roster, is that correct?
That's correct.
Is it your recollection now that after you had the group telephone conversation that you then rang Fiona Cameron and relayed the events of the group telephone conversation to her?
That's correct.
Can I ask you about the telephone conversations with the ULMO staff? You spoke first with Lorraine Walcott
That's correct.
and subsequently you spoke with Heather Zanker.
That's correct.
Heather is a nurse that you know.
That's correct.
How do you know Heather?
We completed our 4-week orientation together in 2004 into primary and public healthcare. She was currently already located at Yuendamu at that time.
She calls you Gilly.
She does.
She was located at Yuendamu at the time you came to know her.
That's correct.
Ms Zanker has worked for many years at the Yuendamu Health Centre, is that right?
That's correct.
She would understand the orientation of the Yuendamu Health Centre.
That's correct.
A health centre's a standard layout, Ms Gill?
The newer builds are certainly standard layouts.
Yes.
We have standard layouts for our equipment. We have a standardised equipment across the Northern Territory government NT health sites. So that what I mean by standardised is that our emergency rooms are predominantly set up the same. Our emergency trolleys are exactly the same. We have checklists that as to what goes where in the trolleys. Medication rooms are set up the same. All our emergency packs are the same from Docker River in Central Australia up to, anywhere in the top end. So our equipment is the same.
Thank you. Can you describe for Her Honour the keys to get into the Yuendamu Health Centre?
Yeah, sure. So our health centres in Yuendamu is the same. So it's a bi-lock lock. So we have one key that will open all doors within the health centre. The only door that the general keys don't open is the health centre manager's door.
All right. So you don't need a particular knowledge of the keys themselves to get into the health centre?
That's correct.
You discussed with Ms Zanker that you would try to arrange additional staff the following day?
That's correct.
Did you have staff that you could have sent to her that day?
That is a possibility.
Can I ask you about the NT Health Risk Assessment Matrix?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Do you have a copy of that document there?
One I prepared earlier, yes. Sorry. Yes, I do.
Have you looked at that document for the purposes of today?
Yes, I have.
And have you tried to track through applying that matrix, which I understand you didn't, from your evidence to Mr Mullins, you didn't do it at the time?
That's correct.
Can you try to track it through now for Her Honour how the events as you understood them would be weighed up in that matrix?
Sure.
Can you put it up on the screen? I can see that Beck's got it there, but I don't have it in front of me, and I think if someone talks to me about this document without me looking at it, be very difficult to follow the evidence.
Sorry, Your Honour. Absolutely.
Your Honour, we probably should just establish in the first instance whether this was the document in existence at the time.
Happy to. I can tell you.
But don't need to tell me, ask the witness.
This is the document in place at the time.
That is correct.
Would you endeavour? I think Mr. Mullins has a better understanding of risk assessment than I do, but would you?
Sure. So,
Would you speak to us?
yep. So, oh, if it's that big, I can see that one. Based on the reason for our temporary withdrawal, it would come under, if you're looking at the consequences, facilities, assets and data.
Sorry, I'll try to help. And I think, Becky, you need to scroll down, please.
Sorry. Next one. Yep, just down there. And so it's a temporary suspension of services due to the loss, damage and unauthorised access, threat to property, plant and or equipment and records.
We might need to start again. Sorry, Ms. Gill. Perhaps you could point to the version you have, or where the...
Okay, so on your screen, is that the screen that you're seeing, Your Honour? So the second one up, the facilities. Where it says
Assets and
facilities. Yep, and go over to the middle. Yep, so the temporary suspension, that makes it moderate consequence.
If it assists, does Your Honour have a hard copy?
I don't have one here.
Would Your Honour, this had a little irrelevant handwriting on it, which is not prejudicial in it. And the highlighted box is something that I highlighted. That's not necessarily what, although I think coincidentally it might have been exactly what the witness has said.
I think, yeah.
And then, so that makes it a moderate consequence. Then if we take into consideration the likelihood, I would refer to this particular incident as likelihood number 5, so almost certain, which shows that the risk event is expected or has already occurred. In this case, it had already occurred. Then if you bring those over to our risk ratings, if you go to the consequences moderate, the almost certain is a very high risk, and then that would make us looking at an intolerable risk, which is what we decided, so therefore we withdrew our staff.
Thank you, Beth.
I hadn't seen those arrows, so I hadn't realised that you worked your way around.
And just one final topic, Ms. Gill. You were asked a question by a counsel assisting that suggested break-ins at houses may or may not be traumatising for people. I think the way it was put to you was if it be trauma. In your role, have you had discussions with staff who have been broken into?
Yes, I have.
Have you found those experiences have generally caused some trauma to the staff?
Yes.
Your belief is that events like that can be traumatising for staff?
That's correct.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Anna.
Anything else, Mr. College?
I promise you very briefly. I just wanted to ask you about checklists and standardised equipment.
Yes.
One reason you'd let's leave standardised equipment alone. But one reason that you produce checklists is to ensure that you check off relevant considerations.
That's correct.
And that's what we see on the risk assessment matrix, isn't it?
That's correct.
So, for example, because it's there,
you can ensure that you take into account any financial consequences of something happening,
That's correct.
or reputational consequences,
That's correct.
or clinical consequences.
That's correct.
All right. Now, I am not in any way suggesting that this was intentional or that you personally should feel responsible for this. But would you accept that an outcome of the decision-making process on the 9th of November might have been that Indigenous staff members felt excluded?
I accept that.
Do you think that a document like this, given that you're providing services in some cases to overwhelmingly Indigenous communities where your staff might be Indigenous, do you think it's important that a document like this identifies a relevant consideration whether or not there are kind of equal opportunity considerations or potential impacts on equal opportunity of decision making?
I accept that.
You can understand that.
Which document are you referring to?
I'm talking about the risk matrix, but
This.
yes. But let's forget about that for a second. Let's say, you know, those, I think you put a list of 5 things that you consider when making a risk assessment.
Sure.
Do you think it would help just to identify really clearly that one of the things that you have to tick off the box is have Indigenous staff been consulted on the decision to leave?
I accept that.
Yeah. And that's just to ensure that we don't end up in tricky situations like this again. And I anticipate that actually the Department of Health has been updating the temporary withdrawal policy.
That's correct. We're
And one of
currently.
the things that it now mandates is consultation.
That's correct.
Is it fair to say that's a lesson learned in some
Oh,
respects?
very much so.
Right. Thank you.
I think you'll be pleased to know that there are no further questions.
Thank you very much, Your Honour.
I meant it very sincerely when I said thank you for the effort that you've gone to in preparing the documentation that you've made available. You've obviously now been questioned quite closely on that information.
That's correct.
And I appreciate that can feel difficult in the witness box. It's not directed at you personally, it's directed at understanding the circumstances that occurred on the day so that we can all learn from that experience. And as you say, there's already been steps to reflect on that and change some practices, and that's we're looking to the future to see if we can do things better. Again, thank you for coming to the evidence today.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Yes, so
The next witnesses are witnesses from Congress. It's now 10 past 12. Would it be convenient to take an early lunch break and come back at 1:10 and commence then, or?
is that what you would prefer, or otherwise we can, but we just need an additional chair, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm told to change the camera angles and some additional chairs, so I'm happy to start now or to, might I just consult with the witnesses?
Sure. Yes, you're allowed.
Thank you.
No, the witnesses are entirely accommodating of the court, so it's really a matter for Your Honour. It would, if I think we come back and have 15 minutes worth of evidence is all we would get to, really.
All right. So is everyone happy to just take an early lunch break and come back at 10 past 1? All right, we'll do that. We'll adjourn for lunch and we'll see.
All stand. The Coronial Court now stands temporarily adjourned.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're right.